edition of the Manhattan Project Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization. Tomorrow, July 3rd, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, will present a revolutionary proposal for the immediate reorganization of the international monetary and economic system. Her intervention on the eve of the July 4th commemoration of the American Revolution's Declaration of Independence seeks to enlist people from all over the world, but particularly from the United States, in a project which is both truly American and international at the same time. The proposal to form an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system seeks to complete the unfinished work begun by many over the past decades, but especially that of her husband, the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. These are not only American figures, such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, or Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. There were others. Prime Minister Nehru of India, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Sukarno of Indonesia, and others who hailed from nations that were not represented at the original 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. In April of 1955, at the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, the spirit of the American Revolution was invoked as a driving force for that assembly. Indonesian President Sukarno opened that conference by referencing the American Revolution as, quote, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. He said, "The battle against colonialism is a long one. And do you know that today is a famous anniversary in that battle? On the 18th day of April, 1775, just 180 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. The tasks outlined at the Bandung Conference, often seen as at odds with American interests of the 1950s, were in fact no different in content than the mission of the American Revolution, though there were certainly differences in form. This July, American revolutionary history should be rescued from the graveyard of misinterpretation and obscurity to inform us of what needs to be done now. Yesterday, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, in a discussion with Harley Schlanger, addressed this.
Just to come back to the initiative that you've taken, I want to emphasize the point that you have a lot of pessimism in the West. The effect of the media, the effect of the war drive, the effect of the divide and conquer tactics that are being used. And part of what you're doing with this call is to try to revive the tradition of the American Revolution. And the Schiller Institute is sponsoring a conference on Sunday, this coming Sunday, where you'll be a participant. How do you see this ability to get across to the American people and the people of Western Europe the difference between the economic tradition of the American system of physical economy versus the insanity of the bubble economy, which everyone seems to be accepting?
Well, I had some discussions with economists in Europe who said, why do you say Bretton Woods? All we need is going back to the UN Charter, the UN principles. Well, that's true. These principles are very valid and they must be upheld. But, you know, as I said before, the reason for the war danger is the final disintegration or threatening disintegration of the Western neoliberal system. And when you are in a crisis like that, it is very useful to go to a tested model in the creation of such a system. And what FDR did work, the New Deal did work, and it had nothing to do with the Green New Deal, but it was a real program of industrialization, which meant that by the end of World War II, the United States had emerged to be the strongest economic power in the world. And, you know, that was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Roosevelt used, which also was the basis of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the after the Second World War. That all goes back to the American system of economy, as in total contrast to the British model of economy. And it has a lot to do with that this history has been suppressed. For example, Bismarck, Bismarck turned under the influence of Henry C. Carey from a free trader into a total fan of the American system of economy, which is, I read about 20 biographies of Bismarck, and it was not mentioned in one. But the main economic advisor of Bismarck at that time, Wilhelm von Kardorff, who was the head of the Industry Association at that time, he wrote a beautiful little book called Gegen den Strom, against the stream, against the tendency, where he describes exactly what is the difference between the American system and the British system. The American system says that the only source of wealth is the individual creativity, which allows a society to again and again to discover principles of the physical universe. And if you translate these discoveries into scientific and technological progress, it increases the productivity in the production process, and that in turn gives you a higher living standard, longer longevity, and a prosperous society. As compared to the British system, which says buy cheap and sell expensive and make the middleman rich. As long as you control the conditions of trade, then you are running the show. And that's essentially what the IMF and the World Bank and so forth are. But I think, the Chinese model, for example, is much more based on the American system of economy, which, among other things, has to do with the fact that Benjamin Franklin was completely fascinated by Confucius, and the collaboration or inspiration between Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen is also an established fact. And Friedrich List is the most known economist inside China. I mean, this is a whole other story, but people just don't know this history, and therefore, this must be a surgical operation, because we will come, and my hunch would be that it is going to be this fall, the latest. We are going into an absolute escalation of mass unemployment, galloping inflation, and in that situation, only a total bankruptcy, reorganization of that system will stop the danger. So again, please look at this call, sign it, and distribute it widely.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
The great fakery which affects people when you mention the word economics is money. They try to explain a system of money which is a sound system, they argue, for running an economy. And as I said, a system of money is insane intrinsically, because it's only paper, it's arbitrary, it has no physical content. Did you ever see money plow a field? Did you ever see a coin talking? If you did, you should talk to about that. All right, so therefore, money has no intrinsic value, nor does gold have an intrinsic value as a currency. These things have determined values by the processes in which they function. Money is merely a medium of exchange. It is necessary because society is composed of tightly integrated and complex social relations. And therefore, in order to process the exchange of goods and other things, you need money as a measure of the social political process of exchange. Money properly is created only by a government, not by anybody else. one of the great evils we have to contend with is money being created by private interests who then sell money on the market for a price, such as central banking systems or private family-style merchant banks, which create currency and demand a monopoly among themselves, among the bankers, of a control over a currency. This is where the problem arises. Because then when this group gets control over the value of money, the power to determine its value by interest rates, yields, and so forth, then man becomes a victim of paper. And evil takes over. So the important thing is, how should we define the production of a necessary medium of exchange called money, or credit issued against money, or charge against the delivery of money? How should we measure that, and how should we control that? Well, obviously it has to be done by a sovereign government. Why? Because the process of production and distribution depends upon a relationship between the income of the individual or firm or entity which consumes and those who produce. In general, the objective is that the cost of production should be less than the price of the goods sold. But that's on the average. The root of this thing is very simple. The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals, including Arnold Schwarzenegger. There is no proper economy. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families in which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them. Discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production. And therefore, essentially, economy starts with purely physical values, in the sense of the physical values dependent upon man's ability to discover universal physical principles and to derive and apply technologies obtained through these discoveries. That is real economics. Now, this economics has two essential features. One, which we already discussed in the process of the conference repeatedly. On the one side, we have what we call universal physical principles per se. These are discoveries of principles which an individual mind makes. Maybe many individual minds make them, but they each make them individually. You don't learn, you don't have a creative process in which somebody makes a discovery and then gets out and describes the discovery to others, and that is not actually transmitting the discovery. That is, the people who receive this instruction, this learning, do not really know what they're talking about. Only the person who creates the idea or who recreates the discovery of the idea actually knows what he or she is talking about. Only he or she is qualified to understand how to apply what is described to those who merely learn. And therefore, it is the participation of people in reenacting discoveries from the past and applying them socially which is the source of the increase of wealth. And therefore, without that process, which includes the process of education, maturation, family relations, and so forth, classical artistic forms of productions, all these things go together to enable human beings to make discoveries of principle, to reenact those discoveries, to apply those principles to practice. and to know how to use tools which are relevant to these kinds of discoveries. And that's how wealth is produced, essentially, from the standpoint of the individual. When we're talking about the individual entrepreneur who runs a small firm, his primary function is as a mediation of these kinds of discoveries or their technologies derived from them. He's become a master of applying these technologies to something for some purpose. He's able to use his judgment in such a way that these things are successful in actually producing more wealth for society in net effect than the cost of that production. That's a simple physical relationship, like the relationship of the individual mind to the discovery of a universal physical principle. Then you have the second aspect. Now let's suppose that you have a very intelligent fellow. He's plunked down somewhere on the planet. He's given a machine tool and so forth, all the materials needed to produce. Is that going to determine his productivity? No. What's going to determine his productivity is the educational system in which that population lives, the level of infrastructure, such as the production and distribution of power, the degree to which the environment is controlled by large-scale water management, by forestation, all these other things which are the conditions of life, the conditions of social life, determine how productive the individual entrepreneur, the individual worker will be in society. So it is not from the individual labor as such that the wealth comes. The ability of man to produce more than the cost of production depends not only on the individual, it depends upon the conditions of life in society in which that individual operates. Therefore, we have the division in economy, which is modern national economy. The division between the activity of the individual as individual, using technologies or perfecting the application of technologies derived from universal physical principles, from the mind of the individual. The individual mind's relationship to nature is the primary thing there. But that does not determine the productivity of labor. What determines the productivity of labor variably is the conditions of society in which this is done. So therefore you have in economy two things to consider. You have the local activity, and you also have then the organization of the society as a whole. The national infrastructure, water management, educational systems, healthcare systems, all of these things which are the responsibility primarily of government. Because it is only government that should own, essentially, all of the territory of a nation. It is government is responsible for all of the territory, whether it is being used productively or not. For example, the quality of transportation will affect productivity of the individual firm. Two firms of equal productivity will vary in their net productivity based on such things as transportation. Now, if you have to get out and spend 2 hours a day each way in that parking lot, which is called a superhighway, to commute to work, to and from work, that is taking time out of your life. Time out of your life which is essentially wasted relative to what should be a rapid transit system for mass transit which would convey you efficiently and quickly to where you go. Similarly, if you diversify in the form of moving industries out from the cities to far distances from those cities, centers of population, you increase the cost of production and may throw the rate of profit of the economy physically into a negative category. Because if people have to travel too far to get to work or to or from work, then you increase the cost of production. So therefore, efficient high-speed transport is an essential part. Also, organizing cities in such a way that places of work are conveniently situated. The best kind of city is one in which you can work at several firms and they're all within walking distance of where you live, or within reasonable mass transit connections of a few minutes between where you reside and where you work. That makes for an efficient city. It makes for efficiency of production. This moving out to the suburbs, The development of suburbia in the post-war period is an example of insanity by governments. Let's take the case of New York City. New York City was a terrible city because it was controlled by the worst people in the United States, or the semi-worst. These were the people, the financial interests that controlled New York City. Since the time of that great traitor to the United States, Aaron Burr, who created the Bank of Manhattan as a swindle under franchise from his patron in Britain, Jeremy Bentham, who is probably the worst pig of recent several centuries. So the city was set up as an exploitation center with great immigration flows into New York City in particular, at the time that it was this great port. You had a system in New York City which is set up to absorb immigrants. And you came into New York as a greenhorn, and you were dumped into the lowest category of habitation and the poorest. After maybe a couple of decades, you work your way up to a slightly higher level of habitation. Your children might actually live in better quarters than you did, and their children might live in better quarters than they did. But the whole thing was a machine for grinding up greenhorns, essentially, and using them for cheap labor. But around Greater New York, because of the requirements and because of the maritime center it was, we had in northern New Jersey and around New York, you had a concentration of industry. That actually New York City, or Greater New York, was one of the great industrial centers of the United States. Not always the heaviest industry, but fairly important. Most of that has now disappeared. New York City is a place where you have to be a prostitute to afford living, a high-priced prostitute at that, to afford living in an apartment building. That's New York City today. But so what they did at the end of the war, they made a decision. It was one of those Truman-type decisions. The decision was to take the potato patches in Long Island and set up what became known as Levittown. These were little shacks, better than these $500,000 shacks you can get around here. But they were shacks nonetheless, and people moved out there. So now you had a process of decentralization, the development of suburbia. Then you had one of the top officials of Sears Roebuck operating out of Philadelphia, who looked at a phenomenon called the National Defense Highway, which was being developed under the influence of President Eisenhower. And they said, well, let's take this area, and if we attach to this National Defense Highway, if we do some suburban development and put up shopping center malls and build housing, suburban housing around these malls and decentralize, we can make a lot of money out of turning potato patches into residential areas. And in the process, areas like Philadelphia, which were affected, began to collapse, disintegrate. So we went from a society which had been developed as the great productive engineering capacity of the world, the United States, and we began to decentralize it, and after the middle of the 1960s, we began to destroy it. The same thing has happened in Germany. People will commute over restricted highways in a country which has not got the lowest population density, and they'll commute as much as 2 hours each way or something like that each day to and from work to a mountain area far distant from Frankfurt and Wiesbaden and Mainz, to a distant location. Whereas in the 1970s, you had in a place like Wiesbaden in particular, you would have a lot of people who would be living in the city at prices of rent they could afford. And the places of employment were generally close to the city. So it was a much more efficient. So you had a decline, a decay of efficiency of the economy through this kind of mismanagement of the economy as a whole, as distinct from the particular enterprise within which production is occurring, farm or so forth. Other things were introduced. So therefore the conditions which are determined largely by government at the federal or national or regional or local level, and especially the government's role in respect to infrastructure, such as power production and distribution, such as land improvements, water management, mass transit, education, healthcare, and organizing places of work so that you have an integrated urban-suburban arrangement which is efficient in which to situate the particular production as such. Now, people say it was to move away from the smokestacks, but that was not the reason. We have the ability to eliminate the smokestacks with existing technology. We have nuclear power, for example, which I could say something in particular. And not to go to nuclear power and not to go on to the development of fusion power is an act of criminal insanity when done by governments. And the reason we didn't do it is because somebody decided to brainwash some young people in the middle of the 1960s and beyond to say that technology is bad. And having started saying technology is bad, they went on and said we've got to get rid of nuclear technology. We've got to go back to burning things again, or cranking up your bicycle as a local power unit, or windmills. You know, you just say, I know why Don Quixote was needed, to get rid of those damn windmills. And so in any case, so the role of government in providing large-scale infrastructure is an essential part of the ability to produce of the local firm, both in terms of production itself and in terms of providing the conditions of life, including social life as well as individual life, in which the relationship between production and consumption and life in general is organized in a rational way. This cheapens the amount of effort required to produce and increases the productive powers of labor by providing cheap power, abundant power of ever higher quality, water, so forth, the whole business. It's much less expensive to provide any service within an urban area which is properly developed than anywhere else. So cities are good. Suburbia can be bad. If you don't believe it, live in one. Wait till the houses go bankrupt here. These $500,000 to $1 million shrink-wrap built shacks out there with plastic exteriors. They have 1/10 of an inch of concrete or cement or brick attached to the outside, hung on the outside as decoration. And inside it's a shrink-wrap shack. And it's not worth 1/10 of the value they put on the mortgage these days. So anyway, so that's the second aspect. The third aspect, which is under the second also, is the question of the way in which social relations are organized. The most important part of this is the way the individual is considered, the way the social process is considered. How do we define man? How do we define the individual? How do you define the individual's needs? What are the individual's needs? Now, in my time, backwardness, as expressed by my father, who was on some things quite backward sociologically, was if you're not being paid for the time you're expending effort, you have no right to any income. That doesn't cost you anything. So if you're doing something very inefficiently and you're not being paid for what you're doing, there's nothing wrong in your having to do it by the worst possible method, because your time is worth nothing. If your time is not being paid for, it's worth nothing. Well, that's not true. One of my fights with my parents and others in my childhood. My time is precious because my time is the time I use to develop myself. And the essential thing about us is our development. We're not animals, we're not monkeys produced like all monkeys before us. We're human beings who are capable of assimilating the contributions, cultural contributions of previous generations. We're capable of solving problems that are left over from previous generations. And whatever we do to develop ourselves to play that role in society or to promote the development of culture is essential to society. The productive power, the productive potential of the population depends upon the development of the individual. Most of this development does not occur on the job. As with children, it occurs before they go to work or before they should be asked to go to work. It's the development of the individual and the quality of development allowed to the individual is crucial in determining the potential productive power of the individual, even though it's not paid. So there's not a cash nexus for everything. Therefore, it's important to save people's time. It's important to reduce the amount of time of commuting to and from work. You are stealing from them if you force them to have to spend more time than necessary in commuting by the way you organize society. That is theft. Maybe if we ask people to be paid by the state for every hour they're compelled to commute as part of their pay schedule, people would realize the importance of this. You look, for example, at society today, latchkey children. You see this stuff. Apart from what the baby boomer problem, the latchkey children phenomenon is increasing. Parents have no time to deal and maintain family life. There is no longer an inner evening dinner hour. If there's sickness in the family, who's going to take care of the kids? You have kids on the street with no social life worth mentioning, often living in fear, especially in poorer neighborhoods, in physical fear of just being alive, wondering where to go to hide from the danger. There's nothing in the family. The parents come home at night, they're grouchy. They're probably working extra jobs or part-time jobs to try to fill in and make an income. The rent is soaring. The cost of power is soaring. Utilities in the house are soaring. The quality of goods are getting poorer and poorer. The shopping malls are getting more and more disgusting and have less to offer of any quality than before. These things are destroying family life, which is an essential part of the social development of the child, is the right to have a family life in which going through childhood and adolescence is buffered by the normal family life, and also a neighborhood life. In former times, the neighborhood would take responsibility, in part, for the children. The neighborhood would take responsibility for helping someone who was ill in the neighborhood. They would just pitch in and help. This was normal in my youth. It was normal even later. People would pitch in and help from among the neighbors. They cared for each other. A child wandering in the street in danger, the neighbors would be concerned. Sometimes they'd be too nosy altogether, but nonetheless they would care. And that's the point. They would care. Today, who cares? It's not my problem. Not my problem. Who cares? And so the lack of caring is an essential part of it. And it's a cost of living. Caring is a cost of living. So that the way we organize is important. Now, how does this affect it? Well, we used to have classical culture. Not very good, but we had it. And in classical culture, what are you doing? When the difference between classical culture and bum stuff that you get today, is that it is of the same nature as, this was beautiful the other day, Megan's Revenge, Sweet Revenge. I richly enjoyed that, and I think she did too. She was getting revenge for all abuses from the past. But the point is just exactly what she did. I mean, it's an illustration of my point where I referred to it. Because the creative aspect, which does not admit of any mechanical formula, of adding a new principal dimension to an undertaking, is the same kind of thing in classical art, in music, or even performing music. Even performing classical composition presents the same problem. Why? Because the question was, as Aaron Smith asked this question, which I belatedly answered, I just got overwhelmed in the rush of things, about the 131 and 132, which I answered yesterday. The 131 or 132, just playing the notes or interpreting the notes doesn't work, or fragmented. You've got to have a unified conception of that composition from beginning to end. A unified conception from the pause before you start to the pause after it ends. And the pauses before and after are an integral part of the music. Because music is not salami. You don't slice it by, piece by piece. It's not composed of slices of salami. Music is composed of a distinction of an object, a unity. And the unity is distinguished, first of all, by a pause before it begins and a pause when it ends. Look, a performer, say a piano performer, good one, will always sit at the keyboard and do nothing. If he goes up and starts playing right away, he doesn't understand music, because he's not thinking about the mind of the audience. He pauses. Why? In order to bring the audience into focus for the transition from the domain of sense perception into the domain of the imagination, where all creative activity occurs. And when the musician has finished the composition, he pauses again, so that the conclusion of the composition does not blend into the response, the visible response by the audience. Therefore, he's facilitating the process by which the imagination occurs. For example, in a classical drama of the classical stage, theater stage, you have the overture. Now the overture ends before the curtain goes up. Otherwise, the director has made a terrible mistake. The ending of the overture creates a pause. The curtain goes up. And because you're trying to transport the audience quickly from the domain of sense perception, of visual and auditory sense perception, into the domain of the imagination. And the same thing is done in any form of art. There's always something that makes the composition, in a classical composition, a distinct object. Not a collection of parts. Not salami, which is sliceable, piece by piece. And the ability to get the audience from the point of looking at the pieces and the sensations to having a sense of this composition as a unity. Now, the 131 is brilliant in one way, as I displayed it. You go from a pause, the performance begins, and it goes through these 7 stages of development. And the performers who know what they're doing will never allow a break in the concentration between the sections. They will always articulate the close of a preceding section such that it goes into and begs going into the beginning of the ensuing section. And therefore the experience of the mind is with these slight apparent dissonances so introduced, which are built into the composition, the mind is forced to see these stages of transition as themselves a unity. In other words, the transitions become a unity, together with a pause at the beginning and the pause at the end become a unity, so the ideas become a single idea. Just like a scientific discovery, or the exercise of a scientific discovery. You have the problem is not solved until the discovery is completed. Therefore, the discovery of a universal physical principle is a unified idea, because it's a process of development which you cannot slice. You have to go from one to the other of the stages of the process of discovery and experimental testing. Otherwise, you don't get it. So therefore, these things which are characteristic of classical culture, I've mentioned one other case. Let's take the case of the easy visible one. Between archaic Greek art and classical Greek art. Archaic sculpture is against classical sculpture. In archaic sculpture, the intention is to create a figure which is balanced, a tripod principle. It stands four square by the force of gravity, does not tilt over. Whereas in classical composition, classical sculpture, the sculpture is by nature off balance. It is never quite a portrait, like a photographic portrait. Never. If you try to paint photographs, you don't understand art. Huh? Because the classical artist always does something else. They create what is actually understandable from the standpoint of the principle of physical least action. They create a distortion such that what you see with the mind, if you reflect on it, is a transition from one condition to another. So what you're seeing is motion, frozen motion, as identified by Keats in the Ode to a Grecian Urn. Motion. This is what the great achievement of Leonardo da Vinci in defining perspective. To put motion into a flat surface by various tricks with color and so forth. Motion. So again, in classical artistic composition or architecture, the same way. Great architecture is based on the same principle as classical sculpture. It's a way it affects the mind. Great architecture should be beautiful in the sense of the mind. It should be classical. It should have a sense of motion in it. You see the difference between the classical Greek sculpture and classical Greek architecture and the poor, ponderous, pitiful attempts at imitation by the Romans. Quite a contrast. So this question of culture is extremely important, even though to some people it is only entertainment. It is not entertainment. It's an essential part of the development of the powers of mind. The ability to think creatively depends upon being able to bring the idea of creativity of the same type that we experience in scientific creativity, and to bring it into the dimension of social behavior, of organized social behavior. This conception of man, which is associated with classical art in that form, is essential motivation and conditioning of the human mind to be able to perform in economy. Dull, mean-spirited, stupid people do not make good economies. So we require not only the ability of the individual to be productive in a physical sense of productivity, we require the individual to be situated in a society which government or powers delegated by government provide the basic economic infrastructure which is needed to make individual production efficient. Infrastructure which defines the difference between failure and success of economies in general. But that's not sufficient. Without classical culture, a classical culture which emphasizes man as in the image of the Creator through classical art, and through the use of the stage and painting and sculpture and so forth as media for communicating that to man, you do not have creativity in society. And without creativity in society, you might as well have chipmunks as people. And they're gradually going for nuts. Now, the problem here is, from the standpoint of the bankers and the other parasites, the sophists and other moral degenerates which proliferate in the world still today, is if we develop man so. See, the cynicist does not object to things being better. They don't object to people being more productive. But they do object to a byproduct of things being better and people being more productive. Because if people are more productive, they will not tolerate being reduced to human cattle. And what we have in society today largely are people who have been transformed, even over the past 2 generations, from the conditions of life of people toward the conditions of life of human cattle. First of all, by taking away productivity, scientific productivity, that degrades human life. By ruining the environmental conditions, by making people travel more to commute to work, by denying them better power facilities, by denying them better organization of cities and other areas. They're making people relatively more productive, less productive and more stupid. But that's their intention. The point is they recognize, especially with the Renaissance and the American Revolution, they recognized that there was a danger to them of a society such as the United States emerging as a republic, which would provide all kinds of good things, and this they would not deny. Some of them would, but in general they would not deny it. But they would say, yes, you're right, but if you let them have that kind of self-confidence of being citizens in that sense, they will no longer be our cattle. And that we will not tolerate. Therefore, what we will do is we will lower the standard of living. We will frustrate science. We will especially discourage scientific creativity. That's where empiricism came from. You cannot discover. You are limited to your senses. You are only an animal. You don't know anything except what your senses tell you. You're an animal. You're an animal. You're an animal. Don't aspire to anything higher than being an animal. That's what we want you to be. If you behave yourself, and if you don't become excessive in numbers, so we have to cull you, and if you don't become old, so we don't want to feed you anymore, then we'll let you live. We'll let you think you enjoy yourself. We'll even let you have entertainment, like cheap free sex on every corner, from whatever you want it from. Huh? We'll let you have that. We may cull you, but we'll let you have that. But don't try to take the power which we reserve to ourselves to decide how society goes. And if you get too smart, you're going to try to run your own society or control who does run your society. And that we will never tolerate. And that's what the issue is. Exactly what the issue is. They say, well, the kind of world we want, the planet we want, will not tolerate a population of 6 billion people. Therefore, we're going to reduce drastically the human population. We'll get it down to less than 1 billion. That is the stated intent of the people behind the present policies. They've said it many times. They've said it very clearly. The Club of Rome, all these guys have said it very clearly. We will not let you have the power you need to sustain a modern society. You can't have nuclear power. We don't mind nuclear power existing if we control it, but you can't have it because it would let you become too powerful, too independent of us. It would let you develop technologies. We don't want you to do that. We want you to rely upon windmills. Huh? We won't let you have classical culture. You'll think. We don't want that. We want you in rave dances, and we'll give you the drugs to enable you to do it. You have George Soros, George Shultz, and others. Legalization of marijuana and other drugs. Why? To make you stupid. Because they want you to be stupid. And people go into drugs, why? Because they say, look, I don't want to realize I'm stupid. I don't want to think. I can't stand my head. I've got to quiet it down. I've got to dumb me down. I've got to go out rave dancing, which have a similar effect. I'll drop from exhaustion, from ecstasy in wild Dionysiac dancing, the cult of Dionysius, which invented drugs and dance came from the Phrygian cult of Dionysius, which this is modeled upon. So these are the problems of economy. First of all, economy is physical, it is not monetary. To believe in a monetary basis for an economy is the first step toward disaster. What we do with the government is we regulate the economy in such a way that the value, money value of products does not rise above the products themselves as a percentile of income. In other words, the percentile of income required to buy a product must not rise above the money income price of the standard of living. And government must do that. How? By regulating interest rates, by regulating the way in which money is put into circulation, by taxation. You tax things that are higher, which are of less value to society. You put a high tax on financial capital gains which are not invested in a useful way. Exactly the opposite of Kemp Roth, and the direct opposite of today's policy. You tax things less if they are investments in productive values. You may tax them not at all if you think they're sufficiently important to people. In other words, if the people invest in producing something, which is so essential to society, we want it, we may tax it almost at nothing. No tax at all. Whereas things which are undesirable should be taxed. Things which are parasitical should be taxed. If there's a tendency toward inflation, tax it out of existence by taxing the people who are inflating values. Protect the prices of things which are valuable. Force the protection of the prices of production of things that are needed. If you want more farmers, make sure the farmers get a fair price. If you want better farm goods, make sure the farmers get a fair price. If you want investment in a certain industry, make sure a fair price is available in that industry. Investment tax credits, of the Kennedy investment tax credit, is just an example of that. So what we do in a sane society is we regulate the flow of money, the issue and flow of money. We regulate interest rates. We regulate trade tariffs. We enter into agreements with other countries on trade in order to protect investments, essential investments of those countries, including our own. So therefore, we regulate the flows of money in such a way that the price of goods, price of money, does not rise above the price of goods. As a matter of fact, we do it in such a way that through productivity, the price of goods will drop in terms of money terms relative to the quality of goods produced. We also demand that a tax program which supports the kind of infrastructural investments we require. For public infrastructure such as power generation and distribution, we will provide, in a sense, what some people call subsidies. We will give favorable treatment in terms of loans, favorable treatment in terms of taxation rates to those. And since we wish to fund the public investment area, that is where the public invests, as we used to, people used to invest their savings, ordinary families would invest their savings for their retirement in public utilities. Public utilities used to be, under Roosevelt and beyond, were regulated. They didn't yield a high interest rate, but they were dependable. People could look forward to retirement or to an emergency knowing that their investment in a bond on a public utility would retain its value, would not be subject to fluctuations on a financial market. We regulated that. So the key thing here is government must regulate. The government must regulate is not a matter of statism versus free enterprise. That's nonsense. 50% of a modern economy at least is in public infrastructure. It costs at least, 50% of the total investment, the total cost of operating an economy is located in basic economic infrastructure. Power, transportation, water management, education, healthcare, so forth and so on. Urban management. And therefore the state must provide that either in the form of direct investment at various levels of government, or it must provide that providing a structure in which private investment is encouraged in public infrastructure, and that area is regulated to make sure it works. And then on top of that, we give incentives, financial incentives in terms of tax, in terms of credit, and so forth, to entrepreneurship, to families who are trying to buy houses or acquire houses and so forth. That is the way the U.S. economy would function when it was following its constitutional intent. And the problem today is we've gone in a different direction. And the problem today is that the people who have taken over, especially since 1963-64, have taken over, are typified by the case of the Southern Strategy of Nixon, which began in 1966 at Biloxi, Mississippi, where he met with the Ku Klux Klan and set up the Southern Strategy, which ran the Republican Party from that point on. And then you had the Suburban Strategy policy, which was set up by Brzezinski, which was set into motion essentially at the beginning of the 1980s. So both parties are now essentially moving in the direction of fascism as party policy, or have already arrived there in some cases. And we've turned away from those policies. We're now at a crisis where, because we have lost sight of what economy is, and because we now substitute money systems and privately controlled money systems, like independent central banking systems, for government control of its responsibilities, we now have a broken down economy. And the problem is largely in the mind of the citizens who have been brainwashed in various ways into believing in free trade. We do not believe in capitalism. We do not believe in socialism. We believe in the American system. And the American system is the role of government in providing the environment, the total environment, in which the entrepreneurship, both for income for profit and other ways of the private citizen, is protected and promoted. Okay, that's it.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
This is a special edition of the Manhattan Project Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization. Tomorrow, July 3rd, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, will present a revolutionary proposal for the immediate reorganization of the international monetary and economic system. Her intervention on the eve of the July 4th commemoration of the American Revolution's Declaration of Independence seeks to enlist people from all over the world, but particularly from the United States, in a project which is both truly American and international at the same time. The proposal to form an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system seeks to complete the unfinished work begun by many over the past decades, but especially that of her husband, the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. These are not only American figures, such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, or Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. There were others. Prime Minister Nehru of India, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Sukarno of Indonesia, and others who hailed from nations that were not represented at the original 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. In April of 1955, at the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, the spirit of the American Revolution was invoked as a driving force for that assembly. Indonesian President Sukarno opened that conference by referencing the American Revolution as, quote, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. He said, "The battle against colonialism is a long one. And do you know that today is a famous anniversary in that battle? On the 18th day of April, 1775, just 180 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. The tasks outlined at the Bandung Conference, often seen as at odds with American interests of the 1950s, were in fact no different in content than the mission of the American Revolution, though there were certainly differences in form. This July, American revolutionary history should be rescued from the graveyard of misinterpretation and obscurity to inform us of what needs to be done now. Yesterday, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, in a discussion with Harley Schlanger, addressed this.
Just to come back to the initiative that you've taken, I want to emphasize the point that you have a lot of pessimism in the West. The effect of the media, the effect of the war drive, the effect of the divide and conquer tactics that are being used. And part of what you're doing with this call is to try to revive the tradition of the American Revolution. And the Schiller Institute is sponsoring a conference on Sunday, this coming Sunday, where you'll be a participant. How do you see this ability to get across to the American people and the people of Western Europe the difference between the economic tradition of the American system of physical economy versus the insanity of the bubble economy, which everyone seems to be accepting.
Well, I had some discussions with economists in Europe who said, why do you say Bretton Woods? All we need is the going back to the UN Charter, the UN principles. Well, that's true. These principles are very valid and they must be upheld. But, you know, as I said before, the reason for the war danger is the final disintegration or threatening disintegration of the Western neoliberal system. And when you are in a crisis like that, it is very useful to go to a tested model in the creation of such a system. And what FDR did work, the New Deal did work, and it had nothing to do with the Green New Deal, but it was a real program of industrialization, which meant that by the end of World War II, the United States had emerged to be the strongest economic power in the world. And, you know, that was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Roosevelt used, which also was the basis of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the after the Second World War. That all goes back to the American system of economy, as in total contrast to the British model of economy. And it has a lot to do with that this history has been suppressed. For example, Bismarck, Bismarck turned under the influence of Henry C. Carey from a free trader into a total fan of the American system of economy, which is, I read about 20 biographies of Bismarck, and it was not mentioned in one. But the main economic advisor of Bismarck at that time, Wilhelm von Kardorff, who was the head of the Industry Association at that time, he wrote a beautiful little book called Gegen den Strom, against the stream, against the tendency. Where he describes exactly what is the difference between the American system and the British system. The American system says that the only source of wealth is the individual creativity, which allows a society to again and again to discover principles of the physical universe. And if you translate these discoveries into scientific and technological progress, it increases the productivity in the production process, and that in turn gives you a higher living standard, longer longevity, and a prosperous society. As compared to the British system, which says buy cheap and sell expensive and make the middleman rich. As long as you control the conditions of trade, then you are running the show. And that's essentially what the IMF and the World Bank and so forth are. But I think, the Chinese model, for example, is much more based on the American system of economy, which, among other things, has to do with the fact that Benjamin Franklin was completely fascinated by Confucius and the collaboration or inspiration between Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen is also an established fact. And Friedrich List is the most known economist inside China. I mean, this is a whole other story, but people just don't know this history, and therefore, this must be a surgical operation, because we will come, and my hunch would be that it is going to be this fall, the latest. We are going into an absolute escalation of mass unemployment, galloping inflation, and in that situation, only a total bankruptcy reorganization of that system will stop the danger. So again, please look at this call, sign it, and distribute it widely.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.